don't get complete HER2 blockade, because there is a heterodimerization happens between the HER2 receptors with the transmembrane receptor domains are there. So what happens if pertuzumab you are giving, you are also blocking the subdomain 2. Once you block the subdomain 2, the HER2 heterodimerization does not happen, and that's how it added the advantage. And in the last point, if you see that it also helps our immune system to kill the breast cancer cells. But with the trastuzumab, it is by the complement mediated toxicity where it causes the tumor killing. But with the pertuzumab, once you block the subdomain 2, immunotherapy, it sometimes like behaves like immunotherapy also. So we have a now better response rate, faster response rate, sustained response rate, you can say, and better PCR, what we are talking since last 15 to 20 years, that everybody is talking PCR. Now finally it has been proven in the large meta-analysis and systematic reviews that the PCR is a very good surrogate marker. Not surrogate, even the DFS and OS has been proved in the all systemic meta-analysis. Thousands of patients are involved, more than 10,000, 20,000, even in the real world. That is important. So there is no doubt in current era that in triple negative and HER2 positive, PCR does have a role, and we all are trying, everybody is trying in the MDT discussion that how we can get more PCR in the breast cancer patient, so that everybody should involve in the better management, and radiation and surgery and chemo all has a better advantage upper added because of these drugs, added drugs, and when you target the biology of the disease. So in early breast cancer, very clear ESMO guidelines are there. Here you can see that when we should start the new adjuvant in HER2 positive, they say if it is more than T2, clinical T2 or T2, it is recommended, or node positive, whatever the size, T size doesn't matter. So now recently, 3 months back, 4 months back, there was a St. Gallen consensus for what is the ideal size of the tumor for new adjuvant therapy in triple negative and HER2 positive. So in triple negative, consensus was like more than 80% has agreed that it should be like more than 1 centimeter you should go. But in HER2 positive, it is 1.6. They have dropped it down 0.4 centimeters more. So that was the consensus, because in St. Gallen, in all part of the world, everybody sits, and more than 80% are now more keen towards the 1.6. But as of now, in our Indian setup, we prefer more than T2 or equal to T2, where we should combine the dual anti-HER2. Otherwise, single HER2 agent can be combined even after the 1 centimeter or 1.5 centimeter, but dual HER2 after the T2 size. So this is what the message I want to give, and it's a clear, now lot of data is there that even T2, if you give a dual anti-HER2, the more PCR is happening, ranges up to 65 to 80% sometime, depending upon the other factors in the biology or the histopathology of the breast cancer. So there were 2 studies, NeoSphere studies, I am not going much detail. 2 phase 2 trials happened for the dual anti-HER2 blockade. One is NeoSphere, one is Trifina. 2 studies were done. Now a very longer follow-up, like more than 10 years follow-up of these happened. NeoSphere was designed to check the when you combine the dual anti-HER2, everybody was concerned about the cardiotoxicity. So it was designed trial rather than for the PCR, it was more designed to detect whether it has any cardiotoxicity added or not. So it was found that it is safe study, and you can see anthracyclines were used in that. So with the dual anti-HER2, if anthracycline, everybody was concerned about the cardiac toxicity. But this study has shown that with adding the second drug, there is no additional cardiac dysfunction happened. That's how it's the safety of the adding second anti-HER2 has been proven. Gradually we have shifted with the Trifina study, where Trifina has shown that you can use even the non-anthracycline based regimen, that is called TCHP. TCHP means docetaxel, carboplatin, trastuzumab and pertuzumab, and here you have completely omitted the anthracycline. The concept that anthracyclines are needed for the breast cancer management in the node positive disease or heavy inflammatory breast cancers or even the T3, T4 size. So the concern, and now the practice has gradually completely shifted that anthracycline is everybody omitting, because initially trial, that is BCIRG 006, where TCH versus AC followed by TH was compared. though this trial was not designed to detect which one is superior, but it was designed that it is non-inferior to the ACTH but with less cardiotoxicity. So non-anthracycline based regimens are now the current standard of care in HER2 positive disease with dual anti-HER2 blockade. So this is what the message, and now enough real world evidences are there. And you can see the PCR rates are up to 60%, 70%, sometimes even 80% in some highly selected patients. If you choose the dual anti-HER2, it may reach up to 80% also, especially where the patients who are not ERPR positive, means if they are triple positive, less chance of PCR. But if the curve is separating, as long as you follow, so in adjuvant setting, wherever you see the graph in any malignancy, like in breast, ovary, colon, the separation of the curve from the control is very narrow. But the flattening of curve is very important. I always give this message. Never see the difference. Always see the shape and size of the curve. Never see how it is different from the control. But how the curve is flattening, that is important. Because the 6%, 7% or 8% OS benefit is a very important benefit and very significant benefit in the long term. So that's how it has shown, and after 10 years even that is showing the benefit. So lot of arguments happen that how much is this difference. So if you clearly select a patient here, the separation of curve will be better. So node positivity, there is much difference, but node negative, much not difference. So you have to select a patient according to the node positivity for dual anti-HER2 in adjuvant setting. This is what this has shown after the 10 years data. So that's all from my side. If any question, I would like to have answer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful knowledge. You have enlightened us with a newer recommendation.
So the patients sometimes do agree to add pertuzumab because of the cost and other concerns in middle of the cycle sometimes. But if you add it, it will definitely give some advantage. Not in the classical setting, but in real world practice we can run this.
Thank you, sir.
Now I call on the stage our organizing chairperson, Dr. A.K. Chaturvedi sir.
Indeed, it was very nice discussion, very nice papers today morning, since morning.
Dr. Ajay Kumar Chaube. I call on the stage organizing chairperson, transmitting awards to the organizing secretary.
Sir,
I call the stage Dr. Chandra Prakash. Alright, now come on the stage, watch us. The call on the stage, Abaria. Like that, what we will join later. Dr. Diksha should join this panel. Dr. Prabha will join later. So, in the view of the next presentation, we will
Today I will discuss about the evaluation risk-based strategy. Cancer is the gynecological malignancy in high-income countries, and gynecological malignancy with incidence 16,413 new cases and 6,085 deaths every year. The incidence peaks is in 60 to 70 years, but in rare cases 2 to 5% in around 40 years. What are the risk factors for the endometrial cancer? This may be estrogen related, that is early menarche, less than 12 years, late menopause, greater than 55 years, nulliparity, and history of infertility, use of tamoxifen in postmenopausal women, unopposed estrogen therapy, estrogen secreting tumors such as granulosa cell tumor and theca cell tumor, PCODs and liver cirrhosis. Other related risk factors are advanced age, that is more than 60 years, Lynch syndrome, that is hereditary non-polyposis coli, type 2 diabetes mellitus, metabolic syndrome, overweight, hypertension, family history of endometrial cancer and prior pelvic irradiation. Now about the fever staging. Cancer staging helps in determining the exact clinical situation of the patient, and it helps in planning the appropriate treatment for the particular patient. And staging of tumor represents one of the most important steps in the process of foretelling of outcome of disease, and it determines the prognosis of the disease. Stage is categorized in 1, 2, 3 and 4, and all stages sub-categorized into 3 groups confined to this uterine corpus, and it is subdivided into 1A1, 1A2 and 1A3. 1A1 is low-grade endometrioid limited to polyp, and 1A2 limited to low-grade endometrioid, and there is myoinvasion less than 50%, and there is no LVSI. In 1A3, low-grade endometrioid carcinoma, that is limited to endometrium or ovary. In 1B, low-grade endometrioid, myoinvasion greater than 50%, and there is no LVSI. 1C, aggressive histologies, which is limited to polyp or endometrium. In stage 2, the tumor confined to the uterus. The 2A is low-grade endometrioid, where the invasion of cervical stroma. 2B, endometrioid with substantial LVSI, and 2C, aggressive histologies with myoinvasion. The stage 3 is limited to serosa, adenosa, or there may be direct spread, or there may be through metastasis. 3A1 is spread to ovary or fallopian tube, and 3A2 involvement of uterine subserosa or spread through uterine mucosa, uterine serosa. 3B is metastasis or direct spread to the vagina or parametrium or pelvic peritoneum. 3B1 is metastasis to direct spread to the vagina, and 3B2 extension to pelvic peritoneum. And 3C, there is involvement of pelvic and or para-aortic lymph node. There may be micrometastasis and macrometastasis. And stage 4, when there is involvement of bladder mucosa, intestinal mucosa, or distant metastasis. 4A is extension to bladder or bowel mucosa, and 4B peritoneal metastasis, and 4C is distant metastasis. What are the key changes which was done in 2023 staging? Stage 1 and 2, there is involvement of LVSI, histologic subtypes, and molecular classification was also added. In stage 3 and 4, metastatic spread to the ovary, distinction of low-grade endometrioid carcinoma involving the endometrium, and refinement of lymph node whether there is micrometastasis or macrometastasis, and the new evaluation of peritoneal carcinomatosis. What are the challenges with staging? There is huge number of data, 14 years of evidence from old 2009 staging to 23, and what are the opportunities? High prognostic precision, identification of treatment-related subgroups, and up-to-date staging system integrating the current level of evidence. Another classification is histological classification, in which two types of uterine tumor, that is endometrioid carcinoma, that is carcinoma variety, endometrioid carcinoma, biloglandular adenocarcinoma, mucinous adenocarcinoma, papillary serous adenocarcinoma, clear cell adenocarcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and undifferentiated carcinoma. In sarcoma variety, there will be leiomyosarcoma, endometrial stromal sarcoma, adenosarcoma, and carcinosarcoma. Histological grading, there may be grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. Grade 1 is less than 5% non-squamous or non-molar solid pattern, and grade 2 is 6 to 50% non-squamous or non-molar solid growth pattern. In grade 3, greater than 50% non-squamous or non-molar solid growth pattern. Grade 1 is considered as well differentiated, grade 2 moderately differentiated, and grade 3 is poorly differentiated. Now about the risk group. Risk categorization is done in 4 groups: low risk, intermediate risk, high intermediate risk, and high risk. In low risk group, there is stage 1 with grade 1 and grade 2 with endometrioid type, with MMR deficient and non-squamous with no LVSI, and stage 1 and stage 2 with pole mutant cancer. In intermediate risk, there is stage 1A grade 3 with endometrioid, and stage 1A non-endometrioid. There may be serous, clear cell, undifferentiated carcinoma, carcinosarcoma, and this is without myometrial invasion and no LVSI or focal LVSI. And stage 1B grade 1, grade 2 endometrioid with deficient MMR and non-specific molecular profile with no focal or LVSI, and stage 2 grade 1 endometrioid type with no focal or no LVSI. High intermediate risk group, stage 1 endometrioid with any depth of invasion, stage 1B grade 3 with endometrioid type regardless of any LVSI, stage 2 grade 1 with substantial LVSI, and stage 2 grade 3 endometrioid type with deficient MMR and non-specific molecular profile. In high risk categories, all stages and all histologies with P53 abnormality and all stages with serous or undifferentiated carcinoma, including carcinosarcoma with myometrial invasion, and all stages of 3 and 4A with no residual disease, regardless of any histology or molecular subtyping. Risk-based stratification was done by Gokran in 1983, and there is 2 types of endometrial cancer. Type 1 comprises of 65% estrogen dependent and low grade or endometrioid histology with favorable prognosis, and type 2 endometrial cancer is clinically aggressive histology, diverse mix of high grade subtypes and histologies, and poor treatment outcome. The integration of molecular classification into international guideline, there some changes occurred when the molecular classification is added. When we see in stage 2, when molecular classification is unknown, it is considered as high intermediate. When there is pole mutant endometrial carcinoma and there is no residual disease, when molecular classification is known, it is considered as low grade, low risk category. And like this, stage 1 endometrioid high grade with no or negative LVSI, when there is molecular classification is abnormality, it is considered as high risk category. What is the limitation of histomorphological classification? There is grade and stage migration from endometrial biopsy to hysterectomy specimen, that is 15 to 30%, and identifying patients requiring adjuvant therapy remain a tremendous challenge, and histologic subtype assignment having moderate concordance among pathologists, that is 60 to 70%, poor reproducibility in identifying multiple pathologic features, and need to bring in more reproducibility and objectivity. There is some fact about the molecular subtype. When there is pole ultramutated, there is low somatic copy number alteration, and this presents with high mutation rate, and it's showing better overall survival and progression-free survival. When the copy number is high, there is low mutation rate, there is poor overall survival and progression-free survival. And in this graph, we can see that the Cancer Genomic Atlas, the pole mutant variety is having excellent prognosis, while the P53 abnormality having the worst prognosis. What is the disadvantage of the Cancer Genomic Atlas? It needs fresh frozen tissue for analysis. Gene sequencing was an integral part of the analysis, and logistic and financial constraints for its global implementation. Another classification is proactive molecular risk classification. This is more practical and could be done on standard formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded samples, and ISC is used for testing. Some facts about the molecular subtypes, that is DNA polymerase epsilon that is pole mutated. These are copy number with stable endometrial cancer, recurrent mutation in exon EPS domain, highest somatic mutation frequencies exceeding 100 mutations per megabase, mostly of endometrioid histologic type, and it is having excellent overall survival, that is exceeding 95%. Mismatch repair deficient, it is having subtype MLH1, PMS2 and MSH2. Epigenetic silencing of MLH1 contributes to majority of this subtype, and lower levels of somatic copy number alteration but a high tumor mutational frequency, and includes both somatic and germ-like mutation. P53 wild type, genomically stable with moderate mutational local endometrial cancer, involves mostly endometrioid histology with estrogen and progesterone receptor positivity, ensuring high response to hormonal therapy, and has intermediate to favorable prognosis. In P53 abnormality, has high somatic copy number alteration and mutation profile, and associated with worse prognosis for 50 to 60% of endometrial cancer mortality. What is the current impact of molecular markers? Molecular markers introducing more objectivity, validation and reliability in prognostic setting, data emerging in its uses as predictive factor, and multi-institutional collaborative studies needed further for its validation and adaptation in Indian settings. Thank you.
Hello. So we should move on second lecture. May I request to come on the dais, Doctor.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you, sir, and the entire Uparicon team for having me here. Today I'll be talking on management of SIN and early stage cervical cancer. So it is considered to be a sin if a gynecologist doesn't know about sin. That is the standard known as CIN, but we keep calling it as sin. So cervical cancer, as we know, is a leading cause of cancer mortality among women. Second most concern among Indian women, following breast cancer. In India, as per 2020, new cases were approximately 1,20,000 and deaths were 77,000. So it has been declared as a global health problem, and the WHO has initiated a program to reach its elimination level by 2030. As we all know, the 90, 70 and 90 protocol. So the definitive precursor lesion the cervical cancer has, and they are CIN 1, 2 and 3. So before understanding cervical cancer, we should understand what is a transformation zone. Because this is the active zone and it is a potential area and the only area where CA cervix usually develops. The transformation zone is a part of cervix. If we can see on the histological side, the cervix has two parts, a ectocervix and an endocervix. The endocervix is unilayered and the ectocervix is multilayered. So the black arrow points out to the unilayered columnar epithelium, the green one to the squamous. The junction where these two meet is called the squamocolumnar junction. At birth, there is only one squamocolumnar junction. As a child, when the lady grows in the reproductive cycle, there is formation of a newer and as well as a old squamocolumnar junction. So basically, there are cells below the columnar epithelial cells which are forming as subcolumnar reserve cells, which proliferate and leads to this development. So the junction between the new squamocolumnar junction and the old squamocolumnar forms the transformation zone. Because of presence of active cells, this area is prone for abnormal proliferation of cells leading to pre-invasive and invasive lesions. So what causes? It is persistent HPV infection and integration of the host DNA and the viral DNA, expression of oncogenes E6 and E7, genetic alteration, progression to CIN. So if we see the progression happens over years, it could be 10 years, 15 years, as long as 30 years. So the CIN 1, 2 and 3. The CIN 1 can regress back and it is very high. The regression takes place over 18 to 24 months and the regression rate is as high as 70 to 80%. However, the progression of CIN 3 to cervical cancer is one way. They rarely regress back to CIN 2. CIN is a histological diagnosis and it is a precancerous lesions. CIN 1 is taken as a low-grade infection as per the last project, and CIN 2 is the in-between, and CIN 3 is the most certain histologic surrogate marker of cancer risk. CIN 2 has got a poorer inter-observed reproducibility, and hence the last project has implemented the use of P16-IHC as an adjunct to categorize them. Anything which is P16 positive is taken to be a high risk and treated more aggressively than if P16 is negative. So we can see that CIN 1 is basically when the dysplastic cells are confined only to 1/3 of the epithelium. CIN 2 when it involves the 2/3 epithelium. And this is an image showing CIN 3 when the entire third is involved. There is a difference between CIN 3 and CIS. CIN 3 more than 2/3 involvement of dysplastic cell. In situ is when just the stromal invasion is absent, but the full thickness includes dysplastic cells. And this is, we can see there is a breach of stromal epithelium leading to invasive cancer. So risk of progression, if we see on the right side, this is the cytology report which shows the progression rate, when to act and what is the time duration you take. So if we see these are the low-grade lesions, ELCIL, ascus, the chance of invasive cancer is very low. But however, as the cytology report increases, if we have ASCH, high-grade lesions or typical glandular cells, the rate of having progression to CIN 3 and invasive cancer is high. So how do we manage them? The management depends on preceding cytology report and also the HPV DNA report if it is available. A preceding low-grade cytology, that is any woman who comes to you with CIN 2 but has a report saying ASCUS or ELCIL, you can wait on them. But if same woman comes with you with the ASCH or a ELCIL report, you need to act aggressively. So how do we act them? Basically, we do either a excisional procedure or keep them on close follow. So management of CIN1, women diagnosed with CIN1 on histology and low-grade smear, they can be kept on surveillance. However, if it persists for more than 2 years, appropriate treatment is needed. Both ablation and excision are appropriate for their treatment. CIN1, as I already mentioned, if it is preceded by a high-grade cytology like ASCH, AGC, HSIL, they need to be managed more aggressively. And if high-grade smear persists for 12 months, and a diagnostic excision is warranted. So this is as per the FOGSI. CIN1 on biopsy, check the preceding HPV cytology report. Low grade, keep them on surveillance. That is, you do a co-test at 1 and 2 years, first and second year. If they both are negative, put them back on routine surveillance. If the same report shows ASCH or HSIL, you categorize the patient and follow with the diagnostic excisional procedure. Moving to CIN 2 and 3, these patients need to be aggressively treated, and with a high grade, a colposcopy is adequate. Both excision and ablation are adequate modalities. Excision is recommended especially if there is a recurrent CIN to see whether the endocervical component is evaluated or not evaluated well. Follow-up of a CIN 2 and 3 without treatment is not acceptable. Immediate hysterectomy is also not the answer for these lesions. So for positive margins after excision, cytology and ECC has to be repeated after 6 months. Hysterectomy is only answer when the patient does not come to you for regular follow-up or does not understand the impact of the condition and has a coexisting gynae condition. Is hysterectomy feasible? So CIN 2-3 on a histology report, go through the review colposcopy report, patient has been adequately basically diagnosed, that is transformation zone as well as the endocervix. If both are evaluated and both are negative, keep them on follow-up. So now what are the treatments of CIN? Basically, we are treating here the transformation zone, which is the culprit. So the transformation zone has to be adequately treated. You treat it either by ablating it or by excising it. Ablation includes thermal ablation, laser ablation or cryoablation. And the excision methods include LEEP, that is nothing but loop electrosurgical procedure, and there are different types, cold knife conization, and the last is hysterectomy. So there are conditions for destructive treatment. You have to visualize the transformation zone completely. That is, it should be type 1. It must be small enough to be covered by the whatever probes you are using. Invasive disease must be ruled out. There should be no suspicion of any glandular disease because glandular disease are very notorious. They are known for skip lesions. There should be no disparity between the cytology and the colposcopy report. There should not have been a previous treatment of the cervix. Patient should, there should not be upper or lower genital tract infections. Moving to the first, in short, I will be telling these methods. Cryotherapy, it is basically cryo refers to cold. There is use of carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide to freeze the cells and cause cell death. So this is achieved by destructive effect by freezing down the tissue to less than -20 degrees Celsius. And again, the probe has to come in contact with the transformation zone. Treatment should be performed, it is a freeze, thaw and a freeze technique. You can see that cure rates for CIN1 are higher compared to CIN2 and 3. So this is the cryo gun which comes with a cylinder. Thermal ablation, here heat is used as a method to kill the cells. So the temperature around here maintained is 100 to 120 degrees Celsius. It is easy compared to a cryotherapy. It is portable, more comfortable. Patient usually complains of lesser pain and can be used as even as a see and treat method, especially for community programs. The cure rates are 85 to 95% for CIN2 to 3 lesions, and the cure rates are similar here to the LEEP, whatever procedure we do for LEEP. So this is Liger's thermal ablative portable machine, and here the next image focuses on, we have to switch on this, and this is kept on the cervix. So moving to excisional procedure, as we can see here, we excise the transformation zone. LEEP is loop electrosurgical procedure. There are 3 types depending on the transformation zone. If it is outside, it is type 1, type 2, depending on the length of the LEEP specimen. So LEAP is again little invasive procedure. Patient needs a daycare procedure to be done under local anesthesia. Conization is also a form of LEAP, but here the cervix is taken in the form of a cone to address the endocervix. This is usually indicated for recurrent CIN, and conization is also an adequate treatment for cervical cancer stage 1A1. The cone shape of the cone depends on the cervix. Hysterectomy is rarely indicated as primary treatment. Vaginal margins needs special consideration here, as 1 to 7% women may harbor vein because this is field phenomenon where the HPV infection can affect the vagina too. So adequate follow-up post-treatment is essential. Moving to novel treatments. Basically till this date, for CIN the management has always been surveillance for CIN 1, and CIN 2 and 3 it is always surgical. So the novel treatment, these are the topical treatments like immunotherapy, imiquimod. It is a toll-like receptor 7 and it increases it basically stimulates the innate immunity to fight back these CIN lesions. Imiquimod has shown a promising result over a period of, the treatment lasts for 8 to 16 weeks. 5-FU is an anti-metabolite, anti-proliferative. It has also shown good results in CIN1. Cidofovir is again an antiviral drug. The problem with these antiviral or these topical treatments is the side effects are too large for the patient to bear. The main burning sensation, pain, tingling sensation, they drop out. So at this point of time, the studies are not sufficient or the data is insufficient for generalizing topical treatment for CIN. The role of therapeutic vaccine, now routinely most gynecologists with the diagnosis of CIN1 or HCV, they are giving vaccine out of benefit of doubt. However, some studies have supported that the relapse rate is reduced when we give vaccine as a therapeutic HPV vaccine, but few studies do not support this. Radiation, especially as for carcinoma in situ lesions, have shown promising result. Now moving to cancer cervix, here we are talking about only 1A, 1B1, 1B2 and 2A lesions. 1A refers to microscopic, 1B1 and B2 lesions of 2 to less than or equal to 4 cm, and 2A involves the upper vaginal without involving parametry. So the treatment depends on the stage of the disease. These guidelines are based on NCCN guidelines. A thorough evaluation is always a must before treating a patient, with clinical imaging must be done. Doubtful cases should always pass through a multidisciplinary meeting comprising of a radiation oncologist, medical oncologist and a radiologist. This was the addendum of the 2018 report where the horizontal margin has been excluded. So why surgery? There is always a debate about surgeons.
Fast forward.
I'll just take 5 more minutes, ma'am. Primary surgery has the advantage of removing the primary disease, avoids radiation-mediated side effects. Sexual dysfunction is underreported, but it is a problem with radiation. And ovarian conservation, especially in premenopausal. So the principles of surgery, it has microinvasive, maybe conservative managed with conization or simple hysterectomy. The diagnosis of cancer cervix preferably should be done through a cone which is at least 10 mm long and has an ECC, that is endocervical curate, should have been evaluated. Fertility sparing has to be done only in thoroughly selected patients and thoroughly selected histology, especially squamous cell and adenosquamous or adenocarcinoma. They should fulfill the conserved criteria. Other option is radical trachelectomy. Otherwise, the standard of care is radical hysterectomy with bilateral pelvic node resection. Open approach is the standard of care, as the LAC trial showed that the disease-free and overall survival was better with open compared to minimal invasive surgery. Lymph node addressal is a must, and the upper limit should be the inferior mesenteric artery. So I just swipe. And the doubt comes especially between the radiation oncologist and to treat 1B3 patients. So 1B3 patients are doubtful patients and they have to be customized and managed. The balance of giving adjuvant radiation has to be taken into consideration, especially the intermediate and the high risk factors. So this was a patient, it was 1B3 and the cervical stromal margin, stroma was not involved on MRI, underwent radical hysterectomy with pelvic node dissection. And 1B3 again standard of care is concurrent chemoradiation, but it can be customized to the patient just like how I showed in the previous images, depending on the histology, need for adjuvant and performance status. So the take-home message would be FIGO stage 2 surgically 1A2 to 1B2, 1B3 and 2A1 need to be customized. Lymph node assessment is essential. Open surgery is the standard of care right now till we have sufficient data. Fertility sparing surgery needs expertise and consent. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. We'll call, and her talk is on the latest concept of the management of borderline and low-grade serous ovarian cancers. She's she visits our hospital too.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'm talking about current concepts for the management of borderline and low-grade serous ovarian cancers. Previously, low-grade serous ovarian cancer, and due to further studies, their treatment differs from high-grade serous ovarian cancers. So the low-grade serous ovarian cancers, they constitute only of 2% of epithelial ovarian cancers, and they are usually borderline ovarian tumors are the precursor lesions. And previously it was grouped with high-grade cancers, but now it is a distinct clinical entity. Most important, these are chemo-resistant patients, usually platinum-resistant, and they had low genetic predisposition. And so molecular profiling is essential for the treatment and development of new therapy for these tumors. Compared to patients with high-grade serous ovarian cancers, those with low-grade cancers, patients are younger, have higher BMI, have low CA125 levels, less likely to have ascites, and these patients have more indolent onset of symptoms. Thus, they are usually diagnosed at advanced stages in FIGO 2 to 4. There is also absence of P53 mutation, and mostly these tumors are hormone receptor positive. 90% are ER positive and 50% are PR positive. So, making progestins or aromatase inhibitors are inciting in this setting. And next, these have a dominant role of MAP kinase pathway. So, they have 40% of KRAS mutation and 5% of BRAF mutations. So, these can be targeted further. So, when we go for surgical management is same as we go for other ovarian cancers. Like for early stage, we go for staging laparotomy, and completeness of cytoreduction is an important prognostic factor. There is a study by GOG 182, and they have reported that residual disease was the only factor independently associated with progression-free survival with a hazard ratio of 2.28. And for stage 1A to 1C1, there is an option of fertility-sparing surgery in low-grade serous ovarian cancers. But unlike the high-grade serous component, where response rate to platinum-based chemotherapy reaches up to 90%, in these tumors the overall response rate of only 4 to 20%. And usually more than 70% patients are diagnosed with advanced stages, and they will usually recur. So because of relatively chemoresistance of these tumors, treatment in the recurrent setting focuses on combination of secondary cytoreduction, hormonal therapy, targeted therapy, or recruitment to any clinical trial. When we come to neoadjuvant therapy for advanced cancers, so it is not, usually platinum-based chemotherapy is not the favored approach for them. There is a phase 2 pilot study which used fulvestrant plus abemaciclib for patients with low-grade serous ovarian cancers, and they have demonstrated 47% overall response rate. In recurrent settings, there is secondary cytoreduction at the time of recurrence should be strongly considered, especially if complete gross resection is achievable, because since these are platinum resistance and chemo resistance, so always surgery is preferable over chemotherapy than in recurrent settings. There is a meta-analysis that is published by Goldberg et al., and that showed that survival was superior for patients whose initial treatment at time of recurrence was surgery as compared to chemotherapy. And there is an expert consensus by ESGO that demonstrated that a lower threshold for surgical management, given the indolent nature of disease and likely survival benefit, even if complete gross resection is not achieved. Coming for chemotherapy, since there are many platinum-based trials for ovarian cancer like ICON-1 ACTION trial, but they have not included the data for, especially separate data for low-grade serous ovarian cancers. So there was exploratory study, that is EGO-META-based, which used a study of 4 randomized trials, and they have found that overall response rate was only 23% compared to 90% also have reported lower response rate of 4%. There is a trial GOG 281 and Milo and got OV11. These use non-platinum based cytotoxic chemotherapies. They have compared standard of care versus the non-platinum based chemotherapy like weekly paclitaxel, liposomal doxorubicin, topotecan. But the response rate of each of these regimens were low, ranging from 0 to 15%. So we have to think of some other option apart from platinum-based chemotherapy. Coming to bevacizumab in primary settings, there were two trials that were studied, GOG 218 and ICON 7. GOG 218 showed 4-month PFS benefit and ICON 7 showed 2-month PFS benefit. But in both these trials, only small number of patients were of low-grade serous cancers and there was no demonstrated survival benefit. When coming to recurrent setting in OCEAN trial and Aurelia trial, there were only 5% of patients with low-grade serous ovarian cancers. But a retrospective study showed that they recruited 17 patients of low-grade serous cancers and there was 55% of response rate with bevacizumab in recurrent settings. So, based on these reports, expert consensus by ESGO is that consideration of the addition of bevacizumab in the treatment of low-grade serous ovarian cancers in the recurrent settings. Coming to hormonal therapy in primary settings, so there are no prospective trials or randomized control trial. There is a large retrospective study done by Gehersen et al. In 203 patients, and they used hormonal therapy like in 57% they used aromatase inhibitor, 29% tamoxifen, 7% leuprolide, 3% leuprolide and letrozole, and they have found that median PFS was 64 months compared to 26 months who haven't received hormonal therapy. So there was significantly improved PFS benefit, but there was no difference in overall survival. Other retrospective studies by Fader et al. And they also showed similar results. There is one large prospective study going on, one is NRG-GY019, which can give the result further. Then when coming to recurrent setting, there is a prospective trial, Paragon study, single-arm phase 2 trial. They evaluated the aromatase inhibitor anastrozole in the setting of recurrent metastatic ER/PR positive low-grade serous ovarian cancers. So they have shown that overall response rate was relatively low at 14%. The median duration of benefit of 9.5 months and the regimen was well tolerated. There is only single prospective study, rest are retrospective studies. So overall response rate was low. However, 62% had a stable disease resulting in a clinical benefit rate of 71%. Additionally, time to progression was longer in patients with ER/PR positive tumors who have given hormonal therapy. So the clinical consensus is that there are no validated prospective studies recommend against using ER/PR status as a driving factor in decision to treat low-grade serous cancers in hormonal therapy. Coming to another MEK inhibitors, because the MAP kinase pathway is involved, so MEK inhibitors are tried. But there is one GOG 281, it is a prospective trial and they use MEK inhibitor. Trametinib, arm received 2 mg orally and they have median followed it for 31 months and they have showed an overall response rate of 26% with clinical benefit rate of 85%. Similarly, Milo trial, it is a phase 3 trial with low-grade serous ovarian cancers with measurable disease and they have also randomized 2:1 to binimetinib once daily or physician choice chemotherapy. And they have shown that PFS did not significantly differ, resulting in early study closure according to the pre-specified futility boundary. But they have shown the important is that treatment with binimetinib has an improved overall response rate. RAM201 is an ongoing trial. So, commonly used hormonal and targeted therapies for recurrent low-grade serous carcinomas. We can use aromatase inhibitor, letrozole and anastrozole. In some, tamoxifen. MEK inhibitors that are used are trametinib, selumetinib and binimetinib. Then coming to CDK inhibitors, there is also pilot phase 2 study that is going on. And in this we have used abemaciclib and 750 patients were recruited. This was 7 patients had a partial response and 5 patients had a stable disease. A Paragon phase 2 trial, it is ongoing trial including letrozole with CDK4/6 inhibitor. So the take-home message for low-grade serous ovarian cancer, it is a distinct entity not related to pathogenesis of high-grade serous cancers, and mutation of BRAF and KRAS mutations are common. P53 usually wild type. These are less chemo-responsive than high-grade serous cancers, and surgery is a valuable option even if optimal cytoreduction can't be achieved. These are usually hormone-responsive tumors. But there are controversies continue about the place of hormone therapy in frontline settings. But in recurrent setting, there is a already published randomized trial. Hormone therapy and trametinib are options for non-surgical treatment of recurrence post-platinum chemotherapy. Thank you.
And I would like you to wait on the stage, and Sahana, please come. And Dr. Poonam Gupta, where are you? Time for mementos and bouquets.
Look at on camera. Okay. Okay, ma'am. Then
Dr. Sahana, ma'am, please wait.
look here, ma'am. Camera. Look here.
Dr. Poonam Gupta is not here. We'll give a.
Look here, ma'am. Camera. जी हाँ चलो. Look here, ma'am. इधर. Side, ma'am. Look here. Hello. Ma'am, look here. Camera. Okay, ma'am. एक मिनट. Wait. Ma'am, hello. Look here, sir. Okay, sir. Welcome. Welcome.
Dr. Anu Tiwari, Dr. U.P. Sahi.
Of Rohil Kant, and I believe I'll be talking today on SBRT in prostate cancer. When I was looking at the theme called Purpose and Precision, I thought I should actually talk something with respect to precision and purpose, and I thought I should actually relate myself with SBRT in prostate cancer. And before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge a couple of people. And one is my parents, and other is Dr. Sriniwas from Proton Centers, who has actually helped me through this presentation of today. So, starting with the presentation. We all know that we have been using NCCN's risk stratification, and risk stratification of NCCN are actually divided with prostate cancer into various risk categories: the low, the intermediate, the high, and the very high. And it all depends upon three factors: the T stage, the PSA, and the Gleason score. Now, when I was looking at the newspaper cutting, I was actually quite surprised to see that there was a cancer prostate, which was among the commonest cancer among the others entity. And And this data, even though it is from 2015 to 2019, it shows that there is prevalence of prostate cancer in India, specifically in the Delhi and the Srinagar region. This caused me more enthusiasm and a little bit more hunger. So I looked at the data. Most of us actually talk about the Globocon data, but I looked at the Indian data with respect to the same. So I digged in and I found a manuscript where I found that the prostate cancer incidence and perspectives from the Indian point of view. The data has been actually taken by the authors from Kerala, from Bhargavi et al., and they found that in Asia, compared to the other continents, there is certain data with respect to cumulative risk, age standardized risk, and truth rate. What delighted me more was that these authors actually dissected the Indian subcontinent into various cities and find out where is the prevalence of prostate cancer with respect to these three risks at the same time. But at the same time, I was quite disappointed because of Uttar Pradesh. There was hardly any data with respect to Uttar Pradesh, and I find the reason is because of the loss of population registries at the same time. The risk stratification by NCCN equally divides them into three categories, 35, 35, and 30. But if you talk about the numbers with respect to Indian subcontinent, with respect to high risk and very high risk, it is around 50 to 70%. Given that, we have evolved, and we evolved in two ways. One is the dose per fraction, and another is the time. I believe there are certain other areas where actually we're using conventional fractionation, where we're using 2 gray per fraction, but now there is an era of moderate fractionation as well as extreme hypofractionation, which has been used at the same time. So what led to this, and how did it change into extreme hypofractionation is the concept of radiobiology. The radiobiology seeding happened early in the 90s, but it was in 1999, Brenner and Hall actually found out that the alpha beta for prostate cancer is about 1.5, making it more sensitive tumor at the same time. Given that, we used this, and what we found, that when we were actually increasing the dose per fraction, we were actually achieving equity 2, which was required to achieve the tumor control probability. But at the same time, what we were doing, even with the increase in the dose per fraction, the normal tissue doses were being decreased. So basically, our aim of TCP and NTCP was achieved in the form of biochemical no evidence of disease with increase in dose per fraction and the total dose being decreased and the normal tissue compliance. So lessons learned, we found multiple trials. The trials were in the form of CHIP, PROPHET, HyPro. There were quite good number of the cases. The arms were different. They used modern hyperfractionation. There were different outcomes in the different trials, but ultimately there was additional, which was like you look at the toxicity, and there was no difference in toxicity in grade 2 when you talk about CHIP and PROPHET at the same time. Similarly, there were other trials happening, the hypo-RT-PC and the PACE-B, but there was a difference. The trial in the former, that was hypo-RT, it talked about 3D-CRT in the majority of the patient, and the margins were more. As a result, the toxicities which were being seen, they were higher. So what does PACE-B do? They improvised upon this. They did what is known as IMRT technique. They used lesser margins, and as a result, the SBRT, when compared to conventional fractions in terms of toxicities was missing, the outcomes were better. Even the worst acute outcome was around 10% versus 27% in GI, whereas in GU it was 23% compared to 27% in conventional fractionation. But what was lacking was none of these trials actually talk about elective regional nodal irradiation. I've taken from Chilkri et al. Paper, and you can see that there are many trials which has been happening in the prostate era, but this trial, everybody talks about a different cranial and the caudal border at the same time. So this, a long-standing question has to be addressed, and this was addressed by Dr. Vedana Murthy and his team, and with the help of a trial called POP-RT, where we use a differentiated prostate-only RT versus the whole pelvic radiotherapy in a very high-risk prostate cancer. So similarly, we simulate the patient in the supine position, we do a uniform bladder filling, rectal emptying, we plan the CT, we make what is known as CTVs, generate the CTVs, and the total dose is just around 68 gray in 25. But if you're talking about the pelvis, you give around a boost of about SID or 50 gray to pelvis. You do the contour, plan is being approved, and a specific way is being done. The POW party, when it was going on, it was always compared with another trial which was RTOG 0924. But the difference, the POW party approach was slightly different compared to RTOG. The lymph node drills, which is calculated by Roche formula, was slightly higher, that was by 5%, which was around total 20%. They stayed the patients with PSMA PET scan, they utilized the ADT for a longer period of time, they used mild or moderate hyperfraction, utilized image guidance, the follow-up was of a longer time, and they even covered the common ileal group of lymph nodes. So when you look at the whole pelvic RT versus prostate-only RT with respect to POW RT, in the terms of biochemical failure, in the terms of disease-free survival, in the terms of distance metastatic-free survival, all the events were better after 24 months or 36 months when you talk about whole pelvic RT. But there were other trials which were happening. There was another trial, the FASTER trial. But this FASTER trial which was happening, they gave around 40 gray in 5 fractions to the prostate and 25 gray in 5 fractions to the pelvic nodes. But this trial, because there was excessive toxicity attributed to high risk, was a kind of a non-inferiority trial. So what these FASTER trial, the authors learned, they started doing another trial called FASTER 2. And the follow-up was about 7 years, and they found there was a tremendous difference between FASTER and the FASTER 2 in improvising upon the tolerability, and the toxicities were being reduced. Another promising trial which was happening across was CETN, and CETN actually learned from the FASTER group. They improvised upon many things: prescription dose, the P3 margins, the better delineation of the volumes, as well as use of image guidance. At the same time as a stereotactic body radiotherapy along with regional lymph node irradiation. Another trial Dr. Vedang actually did was known as the PRIME trial, and this trial was slightly different from what he did earlier. What he did was he included node-positive disease. It is an ongoing prospective multicentric trial, which is the 2-arm randomized controlled trial. What was important in this trial was that it included PSMA PET-CT for all the baseline imaging. And they had 2 arms, one being the standard, other being the extreme hypofractionation. In the standard arm, they used 68 gray, whereas in the test arm or extreme fractionation arm, they used 36.25. And there are multiple centers which are running this trial, including the Tata Kolkata, Apollo Proton, and the Mumbai. Now, what were the strengths? I will say the strengths are basically the limitations of the previous trial. They included node-positive patients. They staged the patient with 100% PSMA PET. I believe this is the first RCT which is including the pelvic nodal treatment. They also emphasized upon image guidance, and there was also assessment of economic impact in the Indian setting, which I believe can be translated at the world's level also. So why PSMA PET scan? Look at the sensitivity, the specific, the positive predictive value, the intermediate and high risk. It's pretty amazing. So that is why PSMA PET scan can be utilized in such patients. Besides what's happening across, we're also doing whole gland escalation, less than 5 fractions SPRT. We're also doing focal dose escalation with SPRT. There is also newer techniques which are actually being practiced like the MRI as well as in proton therapy. So why all these things are important? It is important because one is patient convenience. Patient is very happy, you treat them in 5 days and he happy and goes away and says, fine, I have been treated. Second, if you look at the overall treatment time, if the overall treatment time actually corresponds to the outcome, it is very, very important. If you prolong it, then the treatment outcome can be adverse at the same time. So all these concepts can be actually utilized, the shortening of the time, in basically using what is known as hypofractional treatment, along with the simultaneously integrated prostatic boost. So there was a trial happening in the Netherlands, a multi-phase phase 3 trial called the FLAME trial. It divided them into 2 arms, one being the standard and other being the experimental arm. The standard used 35 fractions, and the other was they used what is known as simultaneous integrated boost up to 95 gray. And surprisingly, the results at the 10 years were tremendously translating in 15% benefit of biochemical disease-free survival in the focal boost arm. So that means we have evolved from a standard treatment to HypoFlame 2.0 nowadays. The difference between FLAME, HypoFlame and HypoFlame 2.0, in HypoFlame 2.0 you actually treat 5 fractions with 2 fractions per week. They included around 124 patients with histological proven intermediate and high-risk prostate cancers, and in these patients they given SBRT to as high as 35 Gray in 5 fraction to the whole prostate gland, and simultaneously, if there was a microscopic near tool which can be visible on the MRI, they actually boosted up to 50 Gray, that is 10 Gray per fraction. Besides, as I told you, that we have a few other things, and those who have actually had the talk of Dr. Anand Kumar yesterday, positively has talked about MR-Linac yesterday, and this is another one. We have 2 centers across the India. This is basically a schematic workflow which actually being utilized in the MRI-Linac clinics, and basically what I would like to stress upon is that there are tighter or even no margins used in the MRI-Linac. It is more associated with adaptive radiotherapy, and there have been multiple trials coming across, and one being highlighted yesterday, Dr. Anil sir also, that he said that there is a difference between, there has been a trial which is happening between MRI guided radiotherapy as well as CT guided radiotherapy, and if you look up towards what is known as a proportion of the acute reactions, probability of them happening in the MRI guided radiotherapy is pretty much less. And one of the reasons could be there is a more tighter margin that has been utilized across. Similarly, we have the proton, and we have got them in India. I will not put much into the proton aspect of here, but yes, proton, when you talk about biochemical disease-free survival ever, even in the intermediate risk or in the form of ultra-hypofractionated reduced, it is quite favorable. And look at the late effects. Probably negligible, 0.36 and 0% in late GIGU, making proton basically a necessity in some cases. The other pro-registries at the same time. When I was actually preparing this presentation, recently ESCO actually also published. So this is from the recent ESCO guidelines where we actually were talking about NRG trial or the RTOG 0924. Well, it did favor with respect to what is known as whole pelvic artery with respect to biochemical failures in the form of translating into 4%, but they did not talk about anything, or there was no difference in overall survival, prostate cancer specific mortality, or distant metastasis. But overall, if I say, if you want to take away that SBRT is definitely safe, it is effective, and we should wait for the Indian RCT, which is actually ongoing. So from me, the take-home message today will be SBRT and extreme hypofractionation is going to become a standard treatment approach. There are advancements happening in the radiation therapy technique, and possible future strategy which is happening is involving the focal dose escalation combined with whole dose de-escalation. Thank you.
Hello. SBRT is, of course, useful for treating these cases. So you should always consider for that. Thank you.
In fact, we have a long experience in using brachytherapy in cancer prostate. We have been practicing regularly, and it's a good tool, and we find minimal toxicity. The complications are hardly.
Okay.
Dr. Sam, so what will be your opinion on using this extreme hypofractionation, especially extreme hypofractionation in high-risk patients?
We have been using extreme hypofractionation in high-risk patients, and the results are really promising. And probably in this center where I am working presently, I have not utilized it. But at Tata Kolkata, we were doing in day and out, and we were using 36 Grade 5. I was in part of Dr. Indranin Malik's team. So I think Sir is also doing a part of the prime. We'll have both in the terms of what is known as survivals or the biochemical free survivals, and probably in the terms of toxicities at the same time. And toxicities are really less in those cases.
Yes. It is a bit different. It's a bit different dosing fractions
Yes.
But it's also believe that the toxicities are
very less. Probably we were using 36.25 and 5 with 25 and 5 to the whole pelvic area at the same time. That is what is being utilized.
Yes. Nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, organizers, for inviting me to UP Aragon, who has a role in prostate cancer, and it's also being done at AIIMS New Delhi also by Harish sir, and few centers like Medanta, and in West it's quite common. So brachytherapy should be as an integral part in the management of prostate malignancies. So my talk for today is the evolving role of radiation therapy in anal canal cancer. Good morning, good afternoon in fact. I am Dr. Karun Kamboj, and I am an assistant professor at AIIMS National Cancer Institute, New Delhi, and during next 15 minutes I'll take you through the journey of anal cancer from historic era to the recent advances. And I'll show how the organ preservation in anal canal cancer specifically helps to reduce the toxicity to the patient and improving the outcome and quality of life in the patients. So first of all, the introduction. What makes anal canal cancer so unique? Because in GI malignancies, the primary modality is surgery. But for anal cancer specifically, as a radiation oncologist, we have the central and primary role. We are not just adjuvant to the surgery anymore. Now we give definitive chemoradiation, and our mission has been to improve the clinical outcomes of the patient and to reduce the toxicity and improve the quality of life for our patients. Let us have a slight look at the basics of anal cancer. That is, almost 90% has the risk factor of HPV. Interestingly, when we look at the general population, anal canal cancer is slightly more common in women than in men. However, there is crucial caveat. The trend is completely reversed in specific MSL group, that is having men sex with men, and also with the patients having HIV positivity. They have substantially higher incidence of having anal canal cancer. So, before 1970s, the primary treatment was radical surgery, that is APR. Then this resulted in permanent colostomy and reduced quality of life of the patient, and survival rate was also less than 50%. Then the Norman Nigro, he introduced the landmark chemoradiotherapy regimen, combining 5-FU and mitomycin C. This neoadjuvant chemoradiation therapy was introduced as a neoadjuvant, and then they see that the complete tumor regression and avoided surgery in many of the patients, revolutionizing the treatment in anal canal cancer. Now there have been personalized RT approaches, like yesterday Dr. Anand has shown the use of MR-Linac and proton therapy also. These being now utilized and under the process of research. So the establishment of anal canal cancer with chemoradiation therapy was serendipity, that it was discovered by chance by Dr. Nigro. He observed all the patients in the APR specimen he received after only 30 grain 15 fraction. There was almost 90% response of the patient, the pathological complete response. So a perfect saying by the pioneer in anal canal cancer treatment, that we began with the intent of making the surgery technically easier. We were surprised thereafter to find that in some patients there was no cancer in the surgical specimen. So the chemotherapy regimen for the Nigro protocol since 1974 has been same, like stable from the decades. However, the radiation therapy has undergone a complete and profound transformation. This is where we as a radiation oncologist, we started our journey. Many of us remember the box fields or the 2D radiotherapy. The problem was very obvious, that we treat massive volumes with these fields, and the dose to the bowel, bladder, genitalia was immense, and there was severe toxicity sometimes, which leads to treatment interruptions and delayed overall treatment time. Then there was a step for IMRT, which gives concave dose distribution and hence improving outcomes and reducing the toxicity. Now, based on this trial, the RTOG 0.29, it's the new standard of care is IMRT in anal canal cancer. and it came in 2013, but there was 42% risk in GI toxicity and 44% risk in geotoxicity, acute toxicity, and making the IMRT as a current standard of care in lower GI malignancies. So as Dr. Ajay also mentioned in the morning that lung cancer has at each and every stage, the lung cancer has stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 has the role of radiation therapy in it. Similarly, in anal canal cancer, all the stages, stage 1, 2, 3 or metastatic stage, also it has the radiation therapy, the definitive role of radiation therapy is in each and every stage. And the bone marrow sparing IMRT, it has been now showing the promising result, giving higher constraint to the bone marrow, which helps in the management of hematological toxicity, which is specifically relevant to our population because the baseline hemoglobin or the parameters to which patient present to us, they are quite like changed. The ACT-1 trial, it established the chemoradiotherapy significantly improved local control by the 12-year result of 25% difference in RT alone versus chemoradiotherapy alone, which improved the local control and reduced the colostomy rates compared to the radiation therapy alone. So I want to bring the attention to this all randomized trial for the treatment of anal canal cancer, especially the ACT-2 trial, which was a multifactorial 2x2 design and established the fact that there is no role of maintenance chemotherapy either with cisplatin or mitomycin C in anal canal cancer. So 2 cycles of concurrent chemotherapy is sufficient during the radiation therapy. Do not add any more cycles to it. Now this brings us to the future and the technological advances. While IMRT has solved many problems related to the toxicity and the quality of life, but still we face significant challenges when it comes to the bulky tumor like T3, T4 growth. So the advances in technology like the MR-Linac, which yesterday Anand sir has shown that the beautifully adaptive plan in each and every fraction, it can lead to the dose escalation and it's under the research phase, which by increasing the dose we can further improve the outcomes of the patient. So this is a meta-analysis by Folk et al. Group. They did a meta-analysis which included 3 studies and compared the IMRT dosimetry with IMPT dosimetry. And there is a clear advantage of IMPT in sparing bowel as an organ at risk. The dosimetric advantage of IMPT is there. But all the studies were retrospective in this. So MR-Linac combines a real-time MRI image and which allows the visualize the tumor and surrounding organs continuously during the treatment. This means we can adapt the plan on the basis of on table the patient, the movement of the organ motion, the daily tumor position and the size of the volume that has been reduced. We reduce our volume, we reduce our toxicity. So the results are more precise and the better sparing of healthy tissue, especially in anal canal cancer, like where the bladder and bowel, they are very in the close proximity to the patient. So on the other hand, the proton, it gives this physics side of the advantage, that the Bragg peak phenomena, where the majority of the radiation is only deposited at the tumor site. I'll not go in the detail, but there is virtually no exit dose. We see the beautiful Bragg peak. So this also leads to the reduction in the radiation exposure to the significant organ at risk and improving the tolerance and potentially reducing the long-term toxicity to the patient. So this I have included Astro Ma Sadgamya, Tamsor Ma Jyotirgamya. The darkness was the era of radical surgery or permanent colostomies to the patient, and when we use 2D radiation fields, the immense volume irradiation. And the light is the precise era of IMRT, where the technical innovation, especially the anal canal cancer, where the functionality of the patient is the pivotal role, and we as a radiation oncologist, we have achieved a massive breakthrough, especially in anal cancer. So I'll conclude with this. So we stand in the era of definitive organ preservation. We are pioneers, like watch and wait in rectal cancer has now become the standard as a non-surgical approach in rectal cancer. Similarly, in anal canal cancer. This has been a long and complex journey with the technological advances. From 2D fields to the 3D CRT, IMRT, now the next generation MR-Linac and Proton maybe. So these technologies are the reason now we can offer better outcomes to our patient and less toxicity. Then obviously the quality of life of the patients becomes much better. Thank you again. This is my institute, National Cancer Institute, and I thanks once again organizers for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Topic is diagnostic effect of radiation with the immune checkpoint inhibitor in hepatocellular carcinoma.
इसका क्या हुआ जी?
Yeah, good afternoon, one and all. At the outset, I'd like to thank the HCC. So this will be my roadmap for the next 15 minutes or so. So as we all know, HCC is the 6th most common cause of cancer and 3rd most common cause of cancer-related mortality. Now, if we talk about the tumor microenvironment, it is a complex ecosystem consisting of the tumor cell along with the stromal tissue, immune cells, endothelial cells or vessels, and cancer-associated fibroblasts, that is extracellular matrix. And all these cells have a constant crosstalk in between, resulting in disease progression. So what are cancer-associated fibroblasts? These are the fibroblasts which are associated with the aggressiveness of the tumor by the release of various autocrine and paracrine factors, and it also results in the activation of different pathways like MET pathway, which in turn leads to disease progression. Like hepatocyte growth factors and vascular endothelial growth factors, these are the factors which are associated with the aggressiveness of the tumor. And we have done a study in which we have found that high VEGF-A and hepatocyte growth factor at the baseline are associated with metastasis at the time of diagnosis. Further, we have also found that the patient with high VEGF-A or HGF post-SBRT, in patients with advanced HCC, they have early progression of disease. VEGF-D is another factor, and angiopoietin-2, these are also associated with high tumor burden. So we have found in our study that angiopoietin-2 is associated with high lymph node involvement. Those patients who progress on anti-VEGF-A therapy, that is bevacizumab, they have high upregulation of VEGF-D, and these patients do respond to ramucirumab. Further, the studies have also found that high angiopoietin-2 and low VEGF-D at the baseline, they are associated with increased chances of toxicity during the treatment. Now, the tumor-associated macrophages, as we all know, the blood-related monocytes, when they reaches the tumor microenvironment, in the presence of interleukin-6, interleukin-12, all this results in pro-inflammatory cytokines, results in tumor regression. However, in the presence of hypoxia, factors like VEGF, HGF, and HGF, this results in the polarization of M1 cells to M2 cells, and these M2 cells results in tumor growth. And same mechanism is there for tumor-associated neutrophils also, where M1 is converted to N2 and in turn resulting in tumor growth. We have different types of immune cells, the MDSCs, myeloid-derived stem cells, Treg cells, and M210s. All these are associated with increased tumor burden, whereas dendritic cell, CD4, CD8, and NK cells, they are resulting in anti-tumor effect. So based on the presence of these T cells within the tumor, we divide the tumor into hot tumors or cold tumors. So if the tumor infiltrating lymphocyte CD8 are less within the tumor, these are known as cold tumor. Sometimes the TILs are there, but they are not within the tumor immunological cell death and abscopal cell death. Apoptosis. With immunological cell death, there is increase in reactive oxygen species, resulting in endoplasmic reticulum stress and in turn DAM signaling, that is damage associated membrane patterns. These DAM signaling result in pattern recognition receptors activation present on the dendritic cell and antigen presenting cells, in turn resulting in activation of dendritic cell and T cell activation. Now these activated dendritic cells in the presence of CCL19 and 21 reach the draining lymph nodes, and here in the lymph node there is priming and activation of tumor associated antigen specific T cell. Now these T cells and other NK cells, CD4 cells are recruited towards that tumor in the presence of different cytokines and chemokines, and in the tumor these activated T cells act on the tumor cell, resulting in release of new antigen, and this process continues. If the activated tumor cell, instead of reaching the tumor, they move to the metastatic site. This is what is known as abscopal effect. So this is one example of one of the patient with abscopal effect. Treatment done in the right side tumor with a lesion in left side of liver. However, we have found that post radiation therapy at 1 month, there is decrease in the size of the tumor which was not treated initially. Now, when we give radiation therapy, at the same time there is some immunosuppressive effect as well. So when we give radiation therapy to the HCC, it results in increase in CCL2, CCL6 like chemokine cytokines, DNA damage repair activation, HIA factors. All this result in increase in TGF-beta, interleukin-2, in turns activation of Tregs, cancer-associated fibroblast, M1 to M2 polarization, and increase in the expression of immune inhibitors on the T cells. These immune inhibitors are CTLA4, PD1, TIM3, VISTA, LAT. So we have done a study in our institution, and we have found that post-SBRT there is increase in PD1 and LAT3 expression, especially in the viral-related HCC, and this was presented in ASLD. Further, we have tried to find out what all other inhibitor markers are expressed. So we have found that there is high LAT3 and TIGIT expression post-SBRT in the T cells. So now these are the patients which are going to respond to immune checkpoint inhibitors. Now how to overcome the radiation-induced immune resistance? So one way is by modulating the radiation therapy, combination of radiation with other immunocheckpoint inhibitors, changing the fractionation size and the sequencing. So what we do, what actually happens in conventional radiation therapy, there is more of a apoptotic cell death resulting in activation of T cell. Now these T cells reaches the tumor as well as the draining lymph node during the time when we are already giving with the radiation therapy. This in turn results in the death of these T cells and hence decrease in the immunosuppression. However, when we give hypofractionated RT, there is more of the immunological cell death resulting in increase in T cell activation, reaching of these T cell activated T cell to the draining lymph nodes and the tumor, and by this time we have already completed with the radiation therapy, and therefore there is more of the tumor regression. Dose also matters. If we give hypofractionated RT like 8 gray into 3 fraction, 6 gray into 5 fraction, so there will be the activation of C-gastrin pathway resulting in increase in double-stranded DNA, which in turn results in dendritic cell activation by interferon beta pathway. However, if we give very high dose of radiation therapy like 20 gray single fraction, it will result in Tregs activation and in turn inhibition of the dendritic cell. So therefore, when we give 8 gray into 3 fraction or hypofractionated RT, it will be a more immunological effect. The same has been proved by different mouse models as well.